Welcome back to our Obscure and Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg series. As always, a link to the playlist as well as the iceberg itself will be in the description. I would also like to give a shout out to our channel members. You can become a member by clicking the join button, or support the channel by simply making sure that you are subscribed. But enough of that. It's time to dive into Tier 5 of the Obscure and Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. We start off with an image taken in June of 2001 by a woman named Andrea. It appears as though she had initially taken a picture of her dog, but when she later examined the photo, she saw something in the background that terrified her. Quoted in an archived ghoststudy.com webpage, Andrea states, "When I saw this picture for the first time, I had a feeling of utter fear. The picture was taken at night in a barely lit room with a Canon ELPH Advantix camera with 200 speed film and a flash. Take a look at the image in the window. It still gives me chills, and I was afraid to go into the backyard at night for months. Friends look at it in disbelief, and others, for lack of a better term, freak out. I'm one of those that still freaks out when looking at it. It resembles some sort of demon." In the center, we see Andrea's dog, but at the top left corner of the image, we can see what appears to be some kind of creature staring into the window. I tried to think of a normal explanation for this, such as trees or bushes, but looking at the enlarged version, it does not resemble any kind of plant. The creature looks like it has a large mouth with sharp teeth, and maybe even an eye staring back at us. It reminds me of a Lovecraftian-style monster, similar to Cthulhu. One commenter would state that maybe it was a reflection from the couch pattern. I will admit that the picture really gave me the heebie-jeebies at first, but the more I looked at it, the sillier I felt. If you look at the right corner of the picture, you can see something is also on the bed. Then look at the reflection of the dog in the window of the original picture. The image is appearing in the same spot as the material to the right of the picture. Maybe a quilt or a pile of laundry? Not so scary anymore. This is a good theory, but we can't see what's on the bed. Only a small sliver of something off to the right. I also tried to reverse image search the picture to see if I could find a better quality version, but was unable to do so. Commenters on this post seem to believe that this is the result of something from the OP's bed, or possibly in their room reflecting onto the window, while others believe this could be some form of demonic or supernatural entity. Looking at the thing is very creepy, but unfortunately, there is no more information to go off of, so it's left to our interpretation. Li Ching-Yuen was a Chinese herbalist who passed away on May 6, 1933. It's believed that he was fully literate as a young child, and, in his early teens, had dedicated his life to gathering and studying herbs in the Chinese mountains. By the time he was in his 50s, he had become a tactical and topographical advisor in the army of General Yu Zhongqi. But the problem here is that Yu Zhongqi was a Chinese general in the late 1600s and mid 1700s. And if you do the math of when Li passed away, that would mean that he had lived to be over 250 years old. Interestingly, not much is known about when exactly Li was born, but there are accounts that state he joined the Chinese army at the age of 71 in 1748, which would mean he would have had to have been born in around 1677, making him 256 years old at the time of his death in 1933. According to Google, the oldest recorded living person was a French woman named Jeanne Calment, who lived to be 122 years old. And scrolling through Wikipedia's list of verified oldest people, there is no mention of Li Ching-Yuen. His story seems to be more myth than historical record. Allegedly, there are reports of documents congratulating him on his 200th birthday from the Chinese government, but I was not able to find them. In a quote from a 1933 Time magazine article, Li would give his secret to a long life. Keep a quiet heart, sit like a tortoise, walk sprightly like a pigeon, and sleep like a dog. His longevity is partially credited to his diet and use of medicinal herbs, and there's even a book published by Li and his disciple titled The Immortal. True accounts of the 250-year-old man, Li Ching-Yuen. The book allegedly provides historical accounts of Li's life, as well as information on how he was able to live for so long, using breathing techniques, herbal medicines, and exercising the mind through meditation and the practice of martial arts. I say allegedly because I have not personally read the book, but it does exist and can be purchased by anybody looking to learn the secrets contained inside. As for the legitimacy of the claims that Li actually lived to be that old, there's not much to either confirm or deny it, other than the date of his death. This is likely why he's not officially listed as the longest person to have ever lived. I also believe that if all of this was true, then the method in which he achieved this would be studied intensely, and our own lifespans would be longer as a result, making me feel like this is more of a myth, perhaps even fabricated in order to aid in book sales. Dorothy Eady was a famous Egyptologist not only known for her work in Egypt, but also for her claims of being the reincarnation of an Egyptian woman from the time of the ruler Seti I. It all started around 1907, when Dorothy fell down a flight of stairs at the age of 3, knocking her unconscious. Her parents, Reuben and Caroline Eady, were both very worried, but thankfully after some time, Dorothy did manage to regain her consciousness. Except now, Dorothy began to speak differently and insisted that she be returned home. This confused her parents, because seemingly, Dorothy was not talking about the home that she shared with them, but they chalked it up to her confusion being a result of the fall. Not long after, Dorothy's parents took her to the British Museum, and when she saw the Egyptian exhibit, Dorothy began to say that this was the home she was speaking of. She even asked where all of the trees and gardens had gone. Normally, this wouldn't be too alarming coming from a young child because they have such vivid imaginations, and usually grow out of phases like this, but this was not the case for Dorothy. She still spoke differently to how she did before the fall, and now after seeing the Egyptian Museum, it seemed as though her beliefs had grown stronger than ever. This would go on to last for the entirety of her life. During her teens, Dorothy attended an all-girls Christian school, but was banned from attending Sunday Mass for saying that Christianity reminded her of old religion, as well as comparing Christianity to Egyptian paganism. Those around her began to get worried about her mental state, so much so that her parents sent her to multiple sanatoriums, all of which had little to no effect on her. At around the age of 16, Dorothy began to claim that the spirit of Seti I, who she also called Ho-Ra, had been visiting her at night to tell her stories from her previous life, all of which she began to write down in hieroglyphic text. According to Ho-Ra, Dorothy was the daughter of an Egyptian soldier named Ben Reshit, meaning Harp of Joy. Her mother was a vegetable seller who passed away when she was 3 years old. But because her father could not afford to raise her, she was sent to the temple of Qom el Sultan in Abydos, Egypt, where she began studying to become a priestess. When she turned 12 years old, the high priests at the temple gave her the choice to either leave the temple and live in the outside world, or stay and become a consecrated virgin of the Egyptian god Isis. She decided to stay. For context, a consecrated virgin is a woman who has been consecrated by the church or temple that remains a virgin and dedicates her life to serving the church. But after 2 years in service, the now 14-year-old Egyptian girl met the pharaoh, Seti I. The pair became lovers, and the girl later discovered that she was pregnant. After going to the priests to tell them about what had happened, she was told that as a consecrated virgin, this was punishable by death. But that wasn't all, because if this was the child of Seti I, then this could be seen as a huge scandal for the pharaoh. Tragically, the young girl opted to take her own life before going to trial, in an effort to not dishonor the pharaoh. Moving into early adulthood, Dorothy landed a job working at an Egyptian magazine, and also met her husband, Imam Abdel Meguid. The two relocated to Cairo and had a son who they named Seti. She also began to go by Seti, which meant Mother of Seti in Arabic, and it was clear that still, even decades after her fall, her beliefs continued to grow, so much so that her marriage began to strain, leading to a divorce. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her son stayed in Cairo, and she began to work at the Egyptian National Department of Antiquities. She was the first woman to work there, and this job granted her the ability to study and work with Egyptian scholars. The locals in Cairo had a somewhat complicated relationship with Dorothy. On one hand, they respected her because she was so knowledgeable in the old traditions, but on the other, they feared her because the idea of her actually being a reincarnated spirit from ancient times made them uneasy. At age 52, Dorothy moved to Abydos, the city in which she claims to have lived in her past life, to work at an excavation site because it was one of Seti's temples that Dorothy believed she had actually lived in. Upon learning about this, the chief inspector of the site decided to test Dorothy and reportedly took her into a dark room inside of the temple. The room was said to have had ancient paintings on the walls that had not yet been published to the public. He asked her to identify the locations of the paintings in the darkness using her reincarnated memories, and to his astonishment, she was able to do this very easily when she should not have had any prior knowledge to the artwork or its locations. Dorothy would go on to help archaeologists extensively in the field, using her knowledge to help navigate ancient ruins and translate hieroglyphic texts until she retired in 1964. Unfortunately, due to her beliefs, neither Christian or Muslim cemeteries would accept her when she passed away at the age of 77 in 1981. She had even constructed a tomb for herself near her home, but the local health authorities did not allow her to be put to rest there. She was eventually buried in a grave in the desert of a Coptic cemetery, but at the very least, she was laid to rest in the country she considered her true home. I will say that despite the pushback she received, Dorothy stayed true to herself for the entirety of her life, up until the very end, and while it is easy to dismiss her claims, the familiarity she displayed when working at the excavation sites and the knowledge she brought forward are undeniable. Perhaps she made a few lucky guesses. Perhaps she was knowledgeable from a lifetime of research. Or maybe she knew what she knew because she had actually lived it. In the town of Zaragoza, Spain in the 1930s, lived the Palazon family, who shared an apartment on what was at the time known as Gascon Gotor Street, but their time living there was all but peaceful. It was in September of 1934 that the family began claiming that they were hearing a voice coming from their stove. The voice sounded male and would scream, laugh, and of course talk to them. Eventually this activity got so bad that they invited neighbors over to see if they could hear the voice as well, and to their surprise, they did. The family lived on the second floor of the apartment building, and soon, the whole building was aware of the creepy voice, but the voice did not appear to happen anywhere except for the Palazon family's unit. There was a lot of speculation, and many of the residents began to believe that the voice was coming from a duende, or in English, an elf/goblin. But this is not a small, friendly elf like those of Santa Claus. In Latin folklore, elves are mischievous beings who are sometimes said to steal children. After a while, the rumor spread so much that the locals would wait outside the apartment unit hoping to witness the activity for themselves. But the one person who heard it the most was the Palazon family's maid, Pascuala Alcocer. Eventually, the duende rumor grew so large that the local police had to get involved, though there is some debate on whether this was done because of real concern or in an effort to calm the public down. Regardless of the reason, the police began their investigation. The first thing that was done was, of course, to search every room in the building, as well as the chimney that all of the stoves in the building connected to. This provided no answers and no evidence of anybody hiding, or there even being any hiding spots to make the voice appear in the Palazon family's unit. But one interesting thing did happen. While conducting the investigations, it's alleged that one of the investigators suggested that the chimney opening be measured. Immediately, the voice manifested itself, responding to this investigator by saying, "You need not trouble. The diameter is just 6 inches." To everyone's surprise, the voice was correct. The entire apartment building was evacuated, and a 30-yard perimeter was established, ensuring that whoever was making the voice had either no way into the building or out. A priest, doctors, and psychologists were all brought in, but suddenly, the voice stopped speaking. The silence lasted for 2 whole days, and by now, the local magistrate was ready to end this spectacle. He felt that this was causing unrest in the locals, as well as wasting resources, so he decided to end the investigation and called it an anomaly, hoping that everybody would just move on. But only a few days after the police left, the voice reappeared, this time saying, "Cowards, cowards, cowards. Here I am." The Palazon family had had enough and moved away from the city, but the rumors began to spread again, forcing the police to return, and now they were the ones being harassed by the voice. The voice would constantly say that it was coming for them, though nothing or anybody would ever appear. The apartment became somewhat of a paranormal tourist hotspot, and people would try to conduct their own investigations, one of which included installing microphones in an attempt to record the voice for a radio show. But this time, the panic forced the governor of Zaragoza to get involved, who made a public statement asking everybody to calm down and to help identify who the prankster making the voice was. Less than a week later, the governor gave an official statement in which they claimed that the voice had come from the young Palazon family's maid. They even went as far as to say that she had done the voice through an unconscious ventriloquism. Pascuala, of course, denied these rumors, stating that she had no memory of doing this, but one of the investigators stated that they had seen this occur, calling it a psychic phenomenon produced only in certain circumstances. And just like that, the investigation was closed, and the government opted to move on with other matters. The public now believed that it was Pascuala, but the authorities had no evidence to charge her with any crime. Following this, she moved away, and that was pretty much that. In 1977, the building was demolished and rebuilt, now named Edificio Duende, which translates to Goblin Building. But I do have a couple of things that I would like to point out. The first was the reported diameter of the chimney, because in all of the accounts that I've seen, they state that the voice said it was 6 inches, which cannot be correct, since in Spain they use the metric system. This could be the result of centimeters being lost in translation, but I just wanted to point this out. Secondly, it's reported that even after the family moved away, the voice remained, but the police still put the blame on Pascuala. Obviously, she didn't have to leave town with the family since she just worked for them, but they were the ones who employed her. So if she had moved, then she would have had to have no reason to be in the building with the police, even if she was somehow unconsciously throwing her voice while she was working there. I don't see how she would be allowed into an area currently being investigated, especially if she was unconscious, making the government claims even more suspicious. I don't blame them for wanting to calm the public down, though this seems more like they just wanted to end the panic by giving a half-hearted explanation. To this day, the truth of who or what made the voice remains unclear, but I guess that's what makes this a mystery. In December of 1945, the Belva Mine in 4 Mile, Kentucky was the site of a mine explosion that took the lives of many miners. Fortunately, a small group of 6 were able to barricade themselves and survive long enough to be rescued, but some of the reports on what happened while they were in the mine have sparked a lot of discussion. Here we have a map of the mine provided by the CDC's report on the incident. The portal in the lower section is the entrance, and we can see at the very top the origin of the explosion very deep within the mine. The explosion itself was the result of a blown-out shot, which is when the explosives used to break the coal in the mine go off without breaking the coal itself, and instead exploding in the air. This can be due to improper placement of the charge, and the result can be very dangerous. In the Belva Mine case, the charge ignited the methane and coal dust that was in the air, spreading quickly and engulfing half of the mine, as seen in the map. The flames, however, are not necessarily the most dangerous part of the crisis, because since there's not proper airflow in a mine, when an uncontrolled fire erupts, then the carbon monoxide inside of the tunnels grows to deadly levels. This is known as afterdamp, and it's completely invisible. During the initial crisis, a group of 9 miners found themselves in the heart of the explosion, but somehow managed to barricade themselves in one of the sections in the mine, using brattice curtains and wood to shield themselves from the carbon monoxide and flames. The miners were stuck inside for 54 hours, during which they kept their faces close to the floor from fear of inhaling the carbon monoxide. During the first 48 hours, attempts were made at finding an exit route that resulted in 2 of the miners collapsing in the afterdamp. And sadly, when the rescue did manage to get to them, one of the miners had already passed away. Afterwards, 2 more miners lost their lives as a direct result of the event, one 2 days later, and the other after a few months. Now you may be wondering, what's so strange about this? It sounds just like a regular mining incident, and you would be correct. But this is just the information listed on the official reports. Allegedly, there is more to the story. According to this newspaper clipping, some of the miners reported that while they were barricaded inside of the mine, a door had appeared, where a man described to be dressed as a lumberjack came out to inform them that everything was going to be okay and that they were going to be saved. Inside of the door was described to be a well-lit room, but the man who came out of the door went back into it, disappearing and leaving the miners trapped yet again. There are theories that this man could have come from an underground base of some sort operating within the mine, but this is a bit conspiratorial if you ask me. This newspaper clipping was the only source that I could find that mentions anything about this occurring. Personally, I believe this was most likely the newspaper trying to sensationalize the event, or possibly some kind of hallucination brought on by the elevated carbon monoxide levels. The idea of an underground base inside of a mine just doesn't make sense to me. Inside of a mountain is one thing, but in a mine where there are constant demolitions taking place, you would assume that someone would have already stumbled upon one of these hidden chambers. Ultimately, I don't think this is much of a mystery, but at least it makes for a good story. Brittany Murphy, an actress notably known for her role in the 1995 movie Clueless, as well as being the voice of Luann on King of the Hill, passed away at the age of 32 on December 20th, 2009. Throughout her career, Brittany landed many high-profile roles and was very successful from an early age. But the film industry can be a very dark place, especially for women, and unfortunately, Brittany would not be an exception. At one point, it's even reported that Brittany was told that she was not enough to land a lead role by producers. Things like this, coupled with her own personal struggles, led to her career declining. This clearly took a toll on her mentally and physically, and eventually, she lost so much weight that people began to speculate on whether or not she was using heavy drugs, or potentially had an eating disorder. All of this would seemingly reach its peak when she married a man named Simon Monjack in 2007. When Brittany passed away only 2 years after marrying Simon, his behavior would lead many to believe that he might have had something to do with her death. But the story gets weirder. For now, back to their relationship. Simon was a screenwriter, and he and Brittany met on the set of The White Hotel. The pair's relationship was concerning to many of Brittany's friends as Simon isolated her from everybody, making the only way to contact her through him. But despite the pleas from those around her, Brittany would not listen, and eventually, Simon moved in with Brittany and her mother. Soon after, he assumed control of her finances, and Brittany's behavior became even more concerning. In a documentary about Brittany's death filmed by HBO, even Simon's friends and colleagues accredited Brittany's drastic appearance changes to the abuse and isolation brought onto her by Simon. He would ultimately be the reason that her career came to an abrupt end. In November of 2009, when Simon showed up to Brittany's movie shoot for The Caller, very intoxicated, producers wanted him to stay back because he was so possessive over her, but he would not let her out of his sight. This led to the producers firing Brittany, making this the last film she would ever work on. Quoted from an article on the NBC New York website. "Bizarre doesn't begin to describe the behavior on set," the source claimed. "It's her husband who is Satan, and he drags her to the dark side. And even after all the horrible things she and her evil dude did, everyone is devastated." Only 2 months after being fired from the set, Brittany would collapse in her home. The paramedics were called to help her, but unfortunately, by the time they got there, there was nothing that they could do.
A hospital spokeswoman has confirmed tonight that the Hollywood actress Brittany Murphy has died at the age of 32. The Los Angeles Fire Department told the website TMZ that an emergency call was made from a home in Los Angeles at 8 o'clock this morning after the actress went into full cardiac arrest.
An autopsy was conducted and determined that the cause of death was pneumonia with severe iron deficiency and multiple drug intoxication. The drugs, however, were all legal and were likely used to treat a cold or infection according to the coroners. Following her death, Brittany's mother and Simon began making appearances in the media, and even did a photo shoot together, which is where many began to question what had actually happened to Brittany. In any suspicious death, the spouse is always the first suspect. But here's the strange part. Only 6 months after Brittany passed away, Simon would also collapse and pass away inside of the same home that he and Brittany shared. Because this was so odd, and with it being relatively soon to Brittany's death, mold was suspected of being the cause of death for both of the victims. Initially, Brittany's mother denied these claims, but would later change her mind and file a lawsuit against the builders of the home. Brittany's father would then attempt to do another autopsy and began claiming that Brittany could have been poisoned. Her mother would deny these accusations and would soon begin to live in seclusion, but she would release an open letter speaking about the situation and attempting to clear the air. In it, she denies all of Brittany's father's claims and explains how he was never in her life to begin with, as he was serving 12 years in jail, furthermore claiming that the sudden interest in Brittany came in an effort to gain money and fame in hopes of making a documentary and writing a book. Her mother would speak about the pain she's felt in losing her daughter and son-in-law, and closed off the letter with this: "She was my baby, and we stood together throughout Brittany's life. Now, I must stand up for her again. It is time for those who really knew and loved her to put those who want to exploit her on notice. Your lies will no longer be tolerated, and as long as I live, will continue to be exposed." There was some suspicion that her mother could have had something to do with the death of Brittany and Simon, with money being the motivation. However, by the time Simon had passed away, there was little money left, because Simon had spent practically all of Brittany's $3 million fortune in the less than 3 years they were together, though there isn't evidence to prove whether or not Sharon was aware of this. I personally don't know if I believe that her mother could have had something to do with all of this, but I would like to say that in Brittany's case, the assumption was that her already bad health contributed largely to her untimely death, but Simon wasn't going through what Brittany was health-wise. His health was not the best, but still the fact that they both collapsed and passed away within a year of each other is strange to say the least. If this was the result of mold poisoning, then I would assume that her mother would have gotten sick as well, seeing as how she lived in the house, but this did not appear to be the case. Ultimately, the autopsies and investigations reported that there was no evidence of foul play, so could it all have just been a strange coincidence? Or could this have been the result of something sinister? Keeping with the theme of strange deaths comes the story of Christopher Case. Chris was originally from Richmond, Virginia, where he started his career as a successful radio DJ. By the age of 35, in 1991, he had worked his way up in the music industry and landed an executive position for the Muzak Holdings Company. But shortly after returning from a trip to San Francisco in April of 1991, he began to act strange, and not long after, Chris was found deceased, fully clothed, sitting in his bathtub facing the wall with his face leaning against it. What was strange was that when police began investigating Chris's apartment, they discovered that surrounding the bathtub were multiple candles and crucifixes. Religious music was also reported to be playing in many of the rooms in his home, and after an autopsy was performed, it was ruled that his death was the result of myocarditis, a condition where the muscles in the heart become inflamed, affecting its ability to pump blood, which in many cases can result in heart failure. This can be caused by certain infections and pre-existing conditions, but it can also just happen for seemingly no reason at all, or at least no known reason. You see, Chris was pretty healthy at 35. He regularly went to the gym, and according to his friends, was well-rounded mentally. So for him to suddenly experience heart failure was very strange to those around him. But there is a lot more to the story, and in order to get the full picture of what might have happened to Chris, we have to go back to his trip to San Francisco. Allegedly, while in San Francisco, Chris had met a woman in his free time, and the two had begun to somewhat hit it off. The problem was that she was much older than him, and to Chris, this was a deal breaker. It was after rejecting her advances that the woman began to get angry with him and told him that she was a witch. She then said that she was going to put a curse on him and that it would cause his death in 1 week. At first, Chris was not too concerned about this. He didn't believe much in the supernatural and figured that she was just mad at him and saying things that would scare him. He would tell his friend Sammy about what had happened over the phone. She too believed that this was nothing to worry about, but in the coming days, Chris would begin to change his tune. Already back home on April 14th, and 2 days after the original phone call with Sammy, Chris would call her again. But this time, he sounded distressed and told her that he was not able to get any sleep because he kept hearing whispers in his apartment. He was also seeing shadowy figures and felt as if he was being watched. The activity would begin to escalate, and another 2 days later, Chris called Sammy again, this time informing her that he had been strangled in his sleep by some invisible force and that it was strong enough to have lifted him up from his bed. Normally, this could be written off as sleep paralysis, but Chris would state that there was even blood on his bed sheets the following morning. This was when he took it upon himself to try and figure out what exactly was going on. That day, it's reported that he had gone to a religious bookstore where he purchased multiple crucifixes and books, informing the store manager that he was attempting to ward off evil witchcraft. When he got home, he set up candles, the crucifixes, salt lines, and played religious music throughout his apartment. There aren't any accounts on what exactly happened on that night, but it's stated that something had scared Chris so badly that he had to leave and checked into a hotel. Worried and already knowing that Chris was going through something, Sammy attempted to do a welfare check on his apartment, but unfortunately when they got there, it was locked and they could not enter. Sammy did get a voicemail from Chris the next day on April 17th. However, her relief was cut short. In the voicemail, Chris sounded calm, despite having spent the whole week stressed out and afraid. He then told Sammy that whatever evil forces that were trying to get him had almost succeeded the night before, but that this was his final day alive. The very next day, the police went back to his apartment and found his body surrounded by candles and crucifixes. Now, with the added contexts of Chris's supposed curse, his sudden heart failure seems a lot more suspicious. As I said earlier, Chris was healthy and of sound mind before he encountered the supposed witch woman, so for him to suddenly believe that he was being tormented by some evil force was way out of character to those who knew him. Something must have really scared him to the point that he went out and purchased multiple crucifixes and spread salt around his apartment. There are, however, a few theories on what could have possibly happened to him. The first was his health. Chris was healthy and young, but myocarditis can happen and does happen to young men who seemingly have no health problems. It is rare, but it does happen. Furthermore, it's believed that the use of some vitamins and supplements can increase the risk of myocarditis, and this could have been the case with Chris. The second theory is that due to his paranoia, Chris may have actually scared himself to death. This too is very rare, but is also possible. Some believe that Chris may have been going through some sort of psychosis, causing him to hallucinate what he believed he was seeing. The stress and terror of it could have been too much, and this could have caused his heart to suddenly fail. And of course, the final theory, which is that the witch's curse was real, but there's no evidence to prove this. In the end, Chris's case remains an enigma, with no cause ever being determined for what could have led to his myocarditis. No foul play was reported in the investigations either, which makes the whole thing even stranger. Regardless of whether it was all just a sudden occurrence or the work of some curse, Chris lost his life way too soon, and while we'll likely never know what actually happened to him, we can only tell his story and hope that he is now resting in peace. This section is about the Family International, originally known as the Children of God cult, a controversial religious movement that started in the mid to late 60s. Now, before we get into it, I would like to give you a warning that the topics we will be discussing in this section are incredibly disturbing, so if you would like to skip ahead, I fully understand, and a timestamp to the next section will be provided on screen. Like many other cult groups, the controversies mostly stemmed from the group's sexual activities, using sex to lure in new members, sharing their partners amongst each other, and the involvement of minors. The Family International did implement rules in 1987 to protect said minors and stop using sex to recruit members in an effort to distance themselves from the controversies, but amongst the adults, partner sharing continued. An eventual raid by multiple government agencies occurred in the 90s, who were concerned about the safety of the children in the group, but thankfully, after a thorough investigation, they found no cases of abuse. Since then, the group has continued to grow, with members from over 70 countries worldwide, but many of their former members continue to speak out against them. This section of the iceberg is not so much about the cult itself, but more about the media that they produced and distributed internally amongst the group members. It was on the r/tip of my tongue subreddit that a former member of the Family International asked for help in identifying a kids show. The user, NoNameGal9999, would upload this post on May 15, 2021. Strange, low-budget religious kids show, possibly late 80s to early or mid-90s. Creepy religious kids show made by a cult I escaped from. I know the title sounds clickbaity, but I assure you, every word of it is true, and what I'm describing is real. I just know it is. Some background: the cult in question is called the Family International, or TFI. I grew up in Huntington Beach, which funnily enough is where the culture started. I was born into it with my parents still remaining members to this day, their start dates for the cult as of now being unknown. What I know for a fact, the show followed a sheep, possibly named something biblical, as they encountered problems. The show was in the style of Sesame Street, with puppets and actors with small animated segments. Standard kids show affairs, right? Well, the problems encountered dove into disturbing subject matter. One segment I recall had the sheep talking to a little boy who had said he wanted to serve Jesus in all the ways he could, with the sheep saying the little boy should give his body to the church, with an animated Jesus standing next to what I recall being children wearing little clothing. The show, from what I remember, appeared to have been made in the 80s judging by the camera quality, but I grew up in the 90s and saw these at only 4 years old, so that puts us at 1994 for my earliest recollection of it. Some of the kids within our group were born in the 80s, and they had seen these too, so that puts a possible start date as late as 1985 to 1989, but I could be wrong. The show came on VHS, and we had hundreds stored away on church property. If these prove the existence of hundreds of episodes, or just means there are multiple copies of the same episode, is unknown. My theories: information is likely scarce for 2 reasons. Either it's been scrubbed to save reputation, or it was produced by the cult with no release outside, so obviously no documentation. I also believe that the actress who voiced the sheep was a gospel singer who sang in numerous videos for the cult dating back to the 70s, which also leads me to believe it may have had musical segments. Children within the cult have also been used for the production as well. I intend to update as new information is found, and I thank anyone who takes the time to read and help to search. The content that the OP described is very creepy to say the least. It's as if the cult was using this media to program the members' children. And if the OP's theories about it potentially dating back to the 80s and early 90s are correct, then that would put the show's production to before the rules protecting children in the group were implemented. A user named Moon is Planet would link a show called Treasure Attic that featured a puppet sheep and fits the description of what the OP described. You can actually find an episode of the show on YouTube.
Now this is a story all about a little lamb that liked to wander off on her own. One day, it got her into a lot of trouble. Are you ready?
Let's go!
Okay, watch this!
There was a lamb called Snow.
While it is creepy, the OP would state that this was not the show they had remembered in 2 updates to the post. The show Treasure Attic got brought up a lot, and while similar, it's not what I'm referring to. I'm led to believe multiple shows were produced and a production studio even being found tied to the cult could be the key to finding this. The more overt nature of it could have been why there's almost no mention of it. It's also likely that this was made by a different studio and just bought by the TFI. That would explain the differing from the other videos as well as the lack of info. Another show that was suggested was The Lovitz, which can also be found on YouTube.
The Lovitz, those happy, loving puppets, with songs of love and songs of joy.
Both of these shows are tied to the Family International, and I believe that the use of puppets was in part due to the low budget in producing this media, but the OP would go on to say that this was not the show they remembered. One user, however, links the website xfamily.org that archives and documents media produced by the Family International. The OP states that none of these videos he remembers, but if we take a look at some of the content, we can find some very disturbing things. There's the Loving Jesus album 4 that features the track Let's Make Love, and I don't think I need to describe it in further detail. There's Flirty Fishing in Osaka, that details the family's practice of using sex to recruit new members, and many more videos, skits, and low-budget shows, most of which featuring children. When you add in the context of what was going on during this time period, it takes on a much darker and sinister tone. A link to the archive is in the source list if you would like to go through it yourself, but I warn you, it is very disturbing. Unfortunately, the OP was not any closer to finding the show that they had seen as a kid, but in a final update to the post, they would inform us that they had contacted another former member and asked them about it. So around 2 days ago, I had attempted to contact the next member asking if they recalled this too, and while they said they didn't, they did state that they recall similar shows with very disturbing material. Seeing as how this was in the 80s and 90s, it's very likely that every form of media that was produced physically and internally distributed to the members of the cult and their families. By providing the members with self-produced media, the family is able to keep them inside of the cult bubble, alienating them from the outside world, and also programming its members from a very young age. One user would comment this: TFI scrubbed all of the child abuse shit pretty thoroughly after the Ricky Rodriguez incident, if I remember correctly, but good luck finding it. There seems to be a lot of confusion on where and under what circumstances the man behind the puppet show propaganda died. For context, Ricky Rodriguez was a former member of the family. In fact, he was looked at as their messiah and worshipped by members of the cult. Despite this, however, Ricky left the group at the age of 21 and later took the life of his abusers as well as his own in 2005. I won't go into details, but prior to this, Ricky recorded himself and detailed his history inside of the cult as well as why he felt he needed to take matters into his own hands for not only himself, but for the other victims of the group as well. This brought more attention to the family, but by then, they had distanced themselves from the past allegations and managed to keep growing. Since the family has already laid the groundwork for destroying or at least hiding the previous media and past association with their history of abuse, it's likely that there are many more forms of media that will never come to light. This, unfortunately, means that the OP probably won't find the creepy kids show that they were looking for, but given the accounts from other former members, I think it's safe to assume that at some point it did exist. Maybe it's better that the videos were destroyed, but sadly, the memories of them as well as the things that occurred to the members will live on in their memories. The royal family is no stranger to controversy, but we're not talking about Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein or King Charles' somewhat disturbing portrait. We're going to be discussing the late Prince Philip's fascination with UFOs and how he almost allegedly had a meeting with an extraterrestrial. Reportedly, Prince Philip's interest in UFOs began when he stumbled upon a classified report in the Royal Archives. The report was written by his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, but it wasn't until his death in 1979 that the report came to light. In the report, Lord Mountbatten wrote about an encounter that had occurred on his estate in the town of Romsey. Reportedly, a strange craft had flown above the estate and landed on the grounds, after which, a being wearing strange clothes and a helmet came out of the craft. This was all witnessed by a man named Fred Briggs, who was a trusted bricklayer for the royal family. After seeing this being, Briggs was reportedly knocked down to the ground by some unseen force, after which he would go on to write a statement about what he had seen. The following was Lord Mountbatten's response. The attached statement was dictated by Mr. Briggs to Mr. Travis on the morning of the 23rd of February in 1955 at my request. My own electrician, Heath, reported his conversation and I subsequently interviewed Mr. Briggs with my wife and young daughter, and as a result of his account, Heath and I accompanied him to the place from which he saw the flying saucer. We followed the marks of his bicycle in the snow very easily, and exactly at the spot which he described, the tracks came to an end, and footmarks appeared beside it. Next to the footmarks were the marks of a body having fallen in the snow, and then the marks of a bicycle having been picked up again, there being a clear gap of 3 feet between where the front wheel marks originally ended and then started again. The rear wheel marks were continuous but blurred. From then on, the bicycle tracks led back to the drive. The bicycle tracks absolutely confirm Mr. Briggs' story, so far as his own movements are concerned. Heath, and I searched the area over the spot where the flying saucer was estimated to have been, but candidly, we could see no unusual signs. The snow at the bottom of the meadow had melted much more than it had at the top, and it would have been difficult to see any marks. This statement has been dictated in the presence of Heath and Mr. Briggs, and Heath and I have carefully read Mr. Briggs' statement, and we both attest that this is the exact story which he told us. Mr. Briggs was still dazed when I first saw him, and was worried that no one would believe his story. Indeed, he made a point of saying that he had never believed in flying saucer stories before, and had been absolutely amazed at what he had seen. He did not give me the impression of being a sort of man who would be subject to hallucinations, or would in any way invent such a story. I am sure from the sincere way he gave his account that he himself is completely convinced of the truth of his own statement. He has offered to swear to the truth of this statement on oath on the Bible if needed, but I saw no point in making him do this. Signed, Lord Mountbatten. This is what is believed to have sparked Prince Philip's interest, but being a part of the royal family and the husband of the Queen herself meant that Prince Philip couldn't just openly speak about UFOs. That could have been seen negatively by the public, and as a result, the prince had to put some distance between himself and his interests. He did this by having his equerry, a man named Peter Horsley, serve as a proxy. Horsley would keep him informed of any UFO activity and find him potential witnesses as well. Horsley would even go on to write a book about his time doing this. It was titled Sounds from Another Room. This would all seemingly come to a head in 1954, when Horsley allegedly met with an extraterrestrial being who wanted to arrange a meeting with Prince Philip. The being informed Horsley that humans were destroying the planet, that they wanted to help, and that they believed Prince Philip could help them, but despite his interest, the meeting did not occur. This was because it was unclear if this being was actually an extraterrestrial or a Russian spy trying to take advantage of the prince's curiosity. A documentary that came out in 2024 called The King of UFOs goes into the royal family's history on the subject, as well as their interest in the paranormal. It is very interesting because, since they are royals, things like the paranormal and extraterrestrials are not spoken of due to it being bad for their image, but there seems to be a lot of history in the royal family that suggests they have always kept an open mind to such things. Prince Philip also had a collection of books on UFOs in his own personal library, and to me, the idea that one of the planet's elites was so invested in researching the subject is kind of funny, but also having the authority to read classified documents, or at least have more access than 99% of the world, makes me believe that perhaps he may have known something that the public does not. The sun is the center of our galaxy. It brings us warmth, and without it, life on Earth would not be possible. But what if the sun was also responsible for influencing major historical events? Allow me to explain. The sun, as you already know, is a giant ball of fire fueled by the nuclear reactions in its core that turn helium into hydrogen. This process causes particles inside of the sun to constantly move, creating a magnetic field that is much stronger than the Earth's and much, much larger. Because of how strong these forces can be, sometimes dark spots can be seen on the surface of the sun. We call these sunspots. Around these sunspots is also where solar flares occur. These can send geomagnetic storms in all directions, including towards Earth. We can see evidence of these through the phenomenon known as the aurora borealis, or in other terms, the northern lights. We've known about sunspots from as early on as the 1600s, but it wasn't until 1843 that scientists began to notice a pattern in the average amount of sunspots that were identified. We call this the solar cycle, which occurs over an 11-year period, during which solar activity ramps up, then slows down, leading to the number of sunspots to either increase or decrease. But something else that scientists began to notice was that the timeline of these solar cycles also lined up strangely with the timeline of historical events. We can see in this graph here in an abstract written by Adam Michalek from the International Astronomical Union. On the left is the average Wolf number, which is just a fancy way of saying the number of sunspots recorded, and on the bottom is a timeline of human history. We can see that as solar activity increases, historical events appear to occur as well. In particular, many revolutions seem to correlate with solar activity, almost as if the solar activity amps up everybody on the planet. There are many scientists who have looked into a potential link, but this is all still theory. And since each cycle takes around 11 years to reset, actual long-term observations would have to span over decades to get a definite answer. We only have 25 documented cycles, with us currently in the 25th. Our current cycle began in 2019 and is set to reach its peak in 2025, and I find this very interesting. With everything currently going on around the world, it is very odd how the solar cycle is also reaching its peak. There have been some scientists who believe strong magnetic fields can potentially affect our brainwaves, and while we have some tools that are able to measure this, we do not have the same level of power that is generated from the sun, or truly know how these galactic level forces can affect the minds of every living thing on the planet. As I said before, there just isn't enough data to make a concrete answer, but the data that we do have seems to hint that there could be a link between solar activity and historical events. At the time of this recording, it's currently 2024 and almost 2025, so hopefully, if the activity is reaching its peak, things die down rather quickly, so that maybe things around the world can begin to calm down again. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. That's all for this video. Leave a like if you made it this far, and as always, thanks for watching.